we
So what I'll do is I'll hand it off to you.
They have many
Relax.
questions, and today we have a great panel that's well experienced in the area of, well, let's just call it what it is. Sexual harassment in the workplace. That's really what
Here's
it
good.
is. And most of you
Actually,
that
let's do it
are
front.
in the HR space, you know that this has been going on forever, but in the public eye, it's been out there for 30 years. There was in 1981, 1991. Anybody remember those dates? Am I going too far back? Okay. And here we are again. So there's some lessons that need to be learned that obviously aren't passed along generationally. So today, our panels, our experts up here are going to share with you some best practices. But before we get started, I'd like to thank an individual that has helped to make this very doable. He's a community-based person, and he's a can make it happen. And if you're ever around this person, you can't help but get energized. You can't. He has an enthusiasm that's very contagious. Further ado, is introduce and bring up to the front Josh Biscay with Ecosystems Concierge. Josh, come on up.
Business Concierge. Thank you, Neil. And every day is a great day for me. Extremely excited and honored for the fantabulous, incredible panel we have today. And this phrase came to me, I heard it, my dad's a preacher, and he was talking about that hope in the present gives power to the future. So I went to a career fair held by Neil, right? And I wanted to go stealth. I didn't even tell him I was coming. And when I parked, I looked at this guy. He was well dressed, and you could tell that he had been going through a hard time, but today gave him hope. In his mind, he was like, oh, I think I might have that job. He was wearing the suit. He had some papers going in there. And as I walked in, I saw that hope in people, you know? How much money, right, is that worth, that hope, that expectation, right? When a baby's born, you're thinking about that expectation, what this kid's going to turn out to be. Maybe he'll turn out brilliant like Cass, who's going to be a future president of the United States. You know, you have that expectation, that hope. And Neil's been doing this for 18 years. And he has 30 places where he does this. He's put hundreds of thousands of people to work. How much hope, right? How much power has Neil given? That's just an amazing job that Neil's done, and I'm honored to be just part of that. And I was at a networking event, and I met a really brilliant person, one of the smartest people I've met in a long time, and that's Megan Hotman. She's going to be a billionaire. She has an app. She's Uberizing the scheduling industry. It's incredible that we have it here. We have Dr. Gardner. Dr. Gardner outspent 5-1 in his election. And I was going to the city council meetings once he got on the council, and he was getting beat up by these evil guys from some evil conspiracy who have more money than God, right? So we run a recall campaign, and we're outfunded. They're spending $300,000, and we win 70-30. So out of nowhere, Underdog Campaign, he comes from an activist who used to come to city council meetings with a burn on his eyes. Everybody thought he was crazy, and now he's the mayor. Not only is he the mayor, he's doing it in retirement. So that brings us to the diversity part of it. Never judge a book by its cover. And we have Rose, we have Coach Mike, who I've been doing business with close to the last 10 years. We have Dr. Sean Andrews, who's written amazing books on the subject. Very honored to have her here. We have Samantha Blake, who worked for the EEOC, and now she has her own private practice that spiked when the Harvey Weinstein thing came down. And we have Rose. And Rose, her and I have been going to networking events for the last 3 or 4 years, and we're formalizing a joint agreement in the diversity space to kind of execute, move the needle, right? And not only, because the thing about execution of diversity is that people think it's a soft skill. It's a political thing, affirmative action, let's help the underprivileged. It has nothing to do with that. It has to do that if you execute diversity the correct way, you're going to make 15 to 30% free cash flow. It has been proven in case studies at Harvard Business Review page and Warren. They've done studies, ironclad. You make money being diverse. And people confuse diversity, right? They think it's race, they think it's gender, they think it's disability, right? They think it's some sort of entitlement program, some sort of welfare. It is not. It's what you see here, right? Is if you have a team of 10 engineers and you bring in somebody from the graphics department, that team is going to make more money. If you have a team of just millennials and you bring in Coach Mike, that team's going to make more money. It's region, right? It's region. It's age. It's having an open mind and focus on business and focus on free cash flow. So this panel is going to be off the charts. We're streaming it on Facebook Live. It's going to have a large, huge shelf life. So if you want people to get educated and get incredible insight, make sure from beginning to end they view our video that we'll download. So without further ado, I give you the CEO, right, of Shift Me, our next female billionaire, Megan Hockett.
I'm not going to say anything after that. So much energy, I love it. Okay, well, we were going to start with the intros, but Josh, I think does anyone have anything to add? I feel like Josh missed anything on the introductions? No, we're good? All right, I think we're good on the intros then. But I do want to understand kind of who is out in the audience and who you guys are. So who here is in human resources or something related to HR? Anyone? Yeah, hands up high? Yeah, half? How about who's in the public sector? Nobody? Everyone's private sector then? Who's in the private sector? Okay, if you're not in one of those, which sector are you from over here? Yeah.
I'm in a tech.
Okay. Public, private, both?
Public.
Both? Public? Okay. So we have a mixed group, mostly HR, mostly public, and then we have a mixed group here as well. Okay, very cool. So we kind of understand who the audience is. So let's get started with this super exciting topic. I'm really excited to hear all of the thoughts from the experts here. But starting off with, what is the Me Too movement and how did it come to where it is today? So who wants to tackle the introduction of the Me Too movement? Do you introduce it?
I can.
Yeah, all right. Pass down this way.
Thank you.
Can I ask a question? Can each one of you, when you get started, say a little bit about yourself?
Sure.
So people know who you are. Thanks.
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Dr. Shawn Andrews. I am a speaker and consultant and an author. As Josh mentioned, I recently wrote a book on leadership, emotional intelligence, gender. It's called The Power of Perception. And it's based on diversity and inclusion. It's based on leadership, based on gender, and how we show up at work and why we don't see more women leading. So that's my business is based on that. And I'm also a professor. I teach in the MBA program at Pepperdine University as well. Happy to be here today. So to answer the first question, I actually did a little bit of research on my own on the topic of Me Too. And it's also, as I mentioned, I've written a couple blogs about socialization of men and women in the Me Too movement itself. But Me Too was started by Tarana Burke in 2006. And the reason she started the movement was to help survivors heal, basically, and let them know that they're not alone. And so her concept is called empowerment through empathy. And her movement is led by survivors. And by doing that, we create massive groups of people that were empathetic towards the survivors, and it helps destigmatize survivors as well. Also, a couple statistics for you. This is based on MeTooMovement.org. Over 17 women have reported a sexual assault since 1990. 17 million women have reported a sexual assault since 1998. And the numbers have been increasing, actually, since the Me Too movement. That's encouraged survivors to come out men and women actually, and let folks know that they're not alone.
And I'll
Yes.
go ahead. Can you hear me? I'm Samantha Blake. I am with XD Incorporated. I've been an attorney since 1993, and my 17 most recent years, I've been focused on workplace discrimination and harassment, first with the EEOC as a trial attorney, and while there I also served stints as an administrative judge and enforcement supervisor, and then I jumped off to join XT after that. XT is an acronym actually for Expert Testimony, Training, and Investigations, and the primary focus of my work is workplace investigations. I also do mediations. With regard to the Me Too movement, as Josh mentioned, beginning in October, there was a definite spike in workplace investigations of sexual harassment. The coming forward of people in Hollywood really, I think, prompted a lot of people across all industries to come forward and report sexual harassment, sometimes going back years. Which, of course, for employers is a little bit perhaps perturbing. And so there's definitely been a spike in workplace harassment claims. And so this is something that you all, I'm sure, have been having to deal with. And so we can address questions also from the audience.
Hi, good morning. Rose Arvalo here. I'm an entrepreneur and also a consultant with On Strategy, where we do strategy execution and executive training. I have been involved with a nonprofit organization called ALPA. That's the Association of Latino Professionals for America. And the focus there is really to develop Latino leaders. Latino leaders either as professionals, university students, or business owners. And so in terms of the Me Too movement, I really think that what we can do as a group within society is to expand really our footprint. Because what we do is provide workshops. We provide workshops mostly to address the soft skills. The soft skills gap that exists right now, mostly with students, but also with some professionals to some degree. And I believe that we can include maybe some additional training to address some of these things, to prevent, to be more proactive, so that we can be prepared and have a better society. I think that's the contribution that we can make, because we work with corporations as sponsors, and so we have that tie-in, but also because we have student chapters throughout most major universities. And so it gives us the legs, it gives us the connections to those groups where I think we could certainly be of value. Thank you.
I'm going to pass on this topic and transition to a topic that is part of that. Coach Mike, Preston EC, business consultant, life coach. And the whole goal, I think, for me today is to help maybe give some context. I'm an old guy, gray hair, belly, and grandkids. I was born in the 50s in Flint, Michigan. Back in the day, my father was of Italian descent, my mother was English-German descent, but they got married. Now, this is back in 1951, which back then could have been considered an interracial marriage. World War II just got over. The Italians had sided with, of all people, Adolf Hitler. So Italians weren't viewed in America as these wonderful, great people. There was questions, a lot of questions. And my father and mother got married. And believe it or not, they had me. And so, born in 1952. And back in that day, to give you context, things like a man would open a door for a woman. It wasn't scoffed about or scorned. It was like common sense or courtesy. People would say, yes, ma'am, no, sir, please, and thank you. That was common courtesy. And so what happened was I grew up in that culture. I also grew up in a culture where food was very important to us. Is food important to you? I believe it is. Most of us here would say it is. Why? Because we have to eat to live, and we don't live to eat. Or some of us maybe we do. I used to, I don't anymore. And that brought me up to another point in life that I learned having a sense of humor was important. Okay? Because when I was young, my father and mother got divorced at 8.5 years of age. That was a stigma back in the day. That was a taboo. You just didn't get divorced. You sucked it up and you somehow got through it. Not my mom and dad. They said, no, we're not going to do this. But yet they lived close enough together, so I was raised by my mother and my father. And in that whole time, I started having questions about relationships. Who am I really? My mom, my dad. Why did they get divorced? Then my mother got remarried, and she divorced him, got remarried again. So a lot of things happened back in the 50s and 60s that now today, you look back at that and say, well, that must have made you a confused person. I was very confused. I was very conflicted. So fast forward from that culture and that kind of paradigm, that context, if you will, to, let's say, a man and woman work together today in an office. And I wrote some notes down here because I'm getting older. And let's say a guy named Dave says to Megan, wow, Megan, that dress looks really hot on you. You don't say that today. That's stupid. Because what does it seem like? That's sexually implicit language, right? So Megan is thinking, either A, I want to slap him, or B, I ought to go to HR and report him. Because I think he should be reported. That's not how you say things to people in this culture. You can say things like, gee, Megan, I love the way you do your colors. That's great. You have a great sense of taste about you. That's way more important and way less sexually implicit. Now, I'm not saying that even back in the day that men didn't take advantage of women. I'm not saying women didn't know they had strong perfume, nice low-cut dresses, and high-heeled shoes. That happens. It happens today. But I think today in the workforce, one thing that, and as a guy, I deal with this a lot, I have to be more sensitive to not just younger people, but females, males, who I work with. I have to learn to control. I don't have to say everything that I'm thinking. Whenever I've thought, you want to just blurt it out and say, I don't think I should say that here. That's called self-control. And so I hope today, as you're in this session and you're asking questions, you're also doing a little bit of introspection. You're looking inside yourself and say, for example, I had a conversation with a person about discrimination. And I said, well, I have to discriminate when I'm driving. What do you mean? Well, when I go to a stoplight, there's 3 lights, red, yellow, and green. Used to be red was stop, green was go, yellow was caution, slow down. Today it's red is stop, yellow is speed up and get through this light, and green is you better make it. So you have to be discriminating. Something I said? I quit my throat. So you have to be discriminating, and you have to learn how to apply quote-unquote discrimination to certain situations. So I hope that gives you some context. Okay? Thank you.
Do you guys want to give quick little intros or add to any of the intros that Josh has given so far?
Background, is that there? I don't think I need it. Do I need it? No, okay. Background on me, I'm a clinical psychologist. I was a former university professor turned software developer, turned internet marketer, turned mortgage banker, turned business consultant. And I went to the dark side and somehow ended up on politics as a mayor. How did that happen? Currently living in Lake Forest. I've lived and worked in Brazil, in South Africa, in Australia, New York, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Michigan, in California. I have nothing to add to what I've heard.
Yeah, that's a good intro. Awesome. You want to give a quick intro?
Yeah, my name's Cassius. I'm representing Kadi Petrie-Norris, who could not be here today, but she's a Yale graduate and businesswoman who's had a long career in business in California, and now she lives in Laguna Beach and is on the housing committee and running for a state assembly. So I'm just representing her. A big part of her campaign is bringing awareness to the lack of representation of women in our political system. Something that happened recently in California in the 2016 election that you might not be aware of, but after all the votes were tallied in 2016, the number of women in the state legislature actually declined. We lost a few women in the state legislature. So we're trying to raise awareness to that, elect more women, make sure more women are represented in business. So that's the voice that we're adding.
And why are you such a great activist, Cassius? What brought you into it? So,
I
at
met
such a
Connie.
young age. You met Connie? All right, awesome.
I can add to that. In 2016, I held a seminar called Women in Politics, and I was working to elect a woman who subsequently became the mayor pro tem in Lake Forest. Anyhow, I did some research on women in politics, and I was only looking in Orange County, and I found out that the reason women are underrepresented in Orange County in elected offices at the city level was because they ran less often. In other words, it wasn't conspiracy by men to keep women out of office. Women ran less often. And in fact, when they ran, they got elected more often than men did. And once they were elected, they were more likely to end up as a mayor or a mayor pro tem. But the main deficit, why they weren't there in the first place, is because they were underrepresented in terms of running. They just didn't run in the first place. That's an interesting, I know there's conceptions of what people have, and then there's also data, so when you're looking at that, you want to look at the data as well.
I would just like to add something to what Coach Mike said. And also, I'm sure that the good doctor wants to address something that was just said there about, but with regard to the comment about, you know, she has a quote-unquote hot dress, I would posit that there is a third reaction that the recipient of such a comment might have, right? I want to slap you, or I've got to go to HR. There's often, and it often depends on generations and what level of power you are at in a company, and that is, did I really hear that right? Did he mean to say it that way? I'm confused. Did I dress too much the wrong way? Should I cover myself up more? There are a lot of things that go through the head of somebody who receives such a comment, and the first response is often not to go to HR, especially if you're fairly new on the job, you're fairly young, or you're fairly low on the totem pole. And this is, I think, why we've seen the surge after the Me Too movement, because people have felt empowered to speak up.
Okay, so
On the other hand, sorry, one more.
Go ahead.
So on the other hand, it might be nice if someone tells you, oh, your dress looks nice, depending on the relationship that you have with the individual. I think that's really important. And it has to do with a matter of respect. If you know the person, if there is a respect, a level of respect, a camaraderie, yes, I think that's really important. So another thing to consider. It doesn't always have to be about sexual orientation or something demeaning. It could be just something nice, a very nice comment that someone might appreciate.
Question for Samantha. Samantha, did you find the perception that employees have of HR as they're going to be their defender, or is it that they see HR as looking out for the company?
That depends a lot on the particular workplace culture. If HR is out there and has demonstrated to its workforce that it will stand behind them, that it will promptly address any issues, then I think people feel more comfortable going to HR. But there are other, workplace cultures where people may not feel comfortable going to HR because they do perceive them as, trying to defend the company, or, and it depends, because you sometimes will get whisper campaigns among employees who will say, well, I went to HR with my issue and, they shot me down, or they didn't find that it was substantiated. And now I still have to work with that boss who, touched me.
So I think the main topic what we're kind of diving into is that 71% of all of these offenses go unreported from females, and it's really, and even like the Bill O'Reilly case that we were talking about earlier, no one reported to HR, and so there's this kind of thing going on where no one is wanting to say anything, and they're really nervous. And like you said, if I were to be receiving that comment, I would probably just be confused and not know what to say. So as Dr. Andrews says, now we're encouraging survivors to come forward, and the reporting is going up a little bit, but why do you think it's still so low? And then what are some ways that we can bring it back up?
Well, it's low for several reasons. Culture is absolutely a big piece of it because culture sets the tone for an organization. So if you happen to work in an organization that doesn't have a safe speak up culture, and you know if you did say something that perhaps is not going to be followed up on or taken seriously, you're not going to say anything. So culture goes a long way. But then on top of that, there's also shame. Oftentimes there's shame because, you know, if you're being harassed in one form or another, you feel like you're the only person who's experiencing that at the time. There's also fear of retaliation by your boss or your colleague. There's people, if you're a bystander or a colleague who notices harassment, why don't those people speak up? Oftentimes people don't want to get involved, and it's again because of retaliation, or they just want to stay out of it. They don't think their company will do anything. But then general lack of accountability is a big reason as well. Accountability by leadership, and you know, people will speak up. If you provide a safe enough culture and enough avenues for people to speak up, they will. But if the culture does not support that, you're going to have both victims and bystanders staying silent. And so I think that's what we still see in the majority of our organizations today.
And I think organizational culture sometimes is a really good concept, but really, how can you change the culture and make this culture available? As opposed to, I mean, the executives get together and say, you know, we're open to having, you know, hearing everyone's issues or concepts, or I think that's happened, but how do you really do it day to day and roll it out?
Yeah. So I'll start this one off. I'm sure we all have different ideas here, but I have a whole list. Actually, I could give you a whole list for this question. But there are a number of things we can do. First, it starts with the sexual harassment policies that's in place. You have to have absolutely no tolerance anti-harassment policies, and you have to stand by those policies and communicate them to the employees. You have to have sexual harassment training, and even civility training is helpful. And that's basic respect. That's anti-bullying training. It could be unconscious bias training. So those are types of civility trainings that go a long way in the workplace, just to teach people, you know, going back to the old values, you know, basically respecting one another. On top of that, we talked about creating cultures, of course, holding employees accountable to report and to follow up, punishing harassers. So when you actually do an investigation, find a harasser, taking action on that, and disciplining them in some form or fashion. I think on a bigger level, we need to value women and what women bring to the workplace, because oftentimes when we hear any hint of sexual harassment, we automatically think we blame the woman, you know, we blame the victim. And so I think we need to start listening more to women and valuing what women are saying at work. And then
you shut up and listen, take notes. And it's amazing what you hear. And they go all over the board about we're this, we're this, we're this, we're that. And I said, well, let me ask you another question. And I know you're not the HR department per se, but in your employee handbook, do you basically list everything out so every employee knows everything that this company believes and basically projects? Pause, silence. I can't believe you just asked me that question. Okay? As HR professionals, and I agree 100%, I think it's imperative that when you have employees in your organization and they actually read the employee handbook, there's a lot of information in there that's not only educational, but it's helping them understand how they operate as an employee. And if you have all those clauses in there, it's a safe place, we have safe environment, and it's all listed out there, the employee signs that and dates that, which says, I have read these policies, I actually agree with them, and I want to be an employee here. So to help you as employers and HR personnel and people, go back to the employee handbook sometimes and read them. You know, I mean, many times people like put an agreement together, and I'll say to Jim or John, did you read the agreement, John? Yeah, I read it, Mike. I'm assuming you did. I'm assuming you say, yes, you read it, you did. I say, okay, so you're ready to execute, correct? Yeah, sign, date, and execute. You'd be surprised, to your point, you'd be surprised how many people don't really listen. I have a theory about men, okay? Are you ready for this? We can listen. We really can listen. However, for whatever reasons, known only to God and men, we choose either not to, or we don't, or we're selective. Or we listen to correct and not listen to learn. Anyone here ever had that? Any man in the room? One of you guys have the, can you raise your hand? Nobody, okay. I love it, a brave crowd. The point is, listening, I listen to learn and not listen to argue. And I think a lot of men feel they have to listen just long enough to be able to argue to fix the problem.
Sounds like Scott Voigt. He's a mutual friend of
Well,
Gardner and ours.
I just listened long enough to argue. So he's right. He's right. And maybe argue with a couple of the other people as well. Reading an employee handbook, God forbid I should ever have to do that, is probably like reading a mortgage, your mortgage document. There's 50 pages long, there's 300 clauses, and do you read it all? I've never read an entire mortgage contract. I've owned hundreds of properties all over the world, never read a mortgage contract. And it's full. I've had jobs all over the world, never read the employee handbook. God forbid I should have to read the employee. So I'm not sure that that's an effective thing. There's a point in which that's important from a legal perspective, to be able to later say, listen, jerk, you signed that you read it. Here's clause 42 on page 73, and you violated clause 72 on 43. We're going to hang you for that. You signed it. So I think it's got a purpose. But to think that reading the employee manual is actually going to help, I'm not sure that that's true. I also think that there's, from most of the people here, there's a Me Too. It should be Me Too now. And I think, you had earlier talked about context and perspective. Segregation in this country ended on January 1st, 1863, I believe is the exact date that Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation. In fast forward 100 years, 1963, there was still plenty of segregation going on. Fast forward 50 more years, so 155 more years. Yeah, there's not a lot of segregation. We pretty much handled that. You hear about cases, but they're pretty abnormal. So 150 years to affect a change in something like segregation. So I think, like segregation, this is, as a social movement, it's an important thing, making everybody on an even field and, respect for each other. All those things that probably all of us value, but I think it's also the perspective. It's not going to happen easily in the first place. And in the second place, you have troglodytes like my friend here and myself, people who were born in a different generation, for which there are different habits. For us, we have to think 3 times before we say something. And if we don't catch it, it comes out because that's almost a quick response. Oh, holy shit. So to some extent, until we die out, those of us who are over 45 and we're gone, it'll be hard to really achieve it in a meaningful way until people coming up now who lived with that. I came up in a anti-segregation environment, etc., and that's why that died out, because the plantation holders and all the racists, and a lot of them, not all of them, were gone, and so we live in a different world. I think you need a perspective. This is a 20-year fight, not a 1-year fight.
And Rose, I think you had
Yes,
some comments.
I do. So now that the workforce really has different generations, multiple generations, we have multiple cultures within our society, at work, at home, in our communities. I think it's important to have engagement, to really follow up on those policies and procedures, to cement them, to make sure that everybody does have an understanding. And also to share, to learn what other people, where they're coming from. Okay, so some people are huggers. It's not meant as a bad thing, it's not meant as a sexual harassment thing, but it's just natural. So where does that fit? And so if someone is a hugger, let's say, and you don't want to be faced with a sexual harassment issue at work, then there needs to be some level of understanding, some level of communication where people say, oh, okay, well, you know, my culture, this is what's standard, the standard practices and so forth. And now we're here, and so how do we change that? How do we interact? Or how do we understand each other that, you know, when this happens, it's not axing me out of work? Thank you.
And I think that's a good question to ask the panel, or even to ask anyone in the audience, so please feel free to add any responses or questions, but, you know, kind of asking where the line is drawn or how you communicate those kind of blurred lines, if anyone has any.
I want to know from Cass and Megan, the conversations that Dr. Gardner and Coach Mike are talking about, how are those conversations managed? I know, Cass, you're 20, and Megan, you're 27. How's your generation handling those conversations?
Yeah. Well, I guess if we're talking about culture, the experience that I could offer on Kadi's campaign, being the only guy that's on that campaign, is that culture is people. Just as the culture of this room would change if we wheeled in a bunch of retirees, the culture on our campaign or the culture in your business is the people themselves that are there in the meeting, in the room, participating in that. And it's really important as we're communicating with people in our community, as you're communicating with your customers, to keep that in mind, because that affects the people in your business, how they're gonna interact with each other, how comfortable they're gonna feel mentioning things, talking about things that they might otherwise not do if the culture was different, if the people were different. That's what I think.
Awesome. You see why I'm saying he's the next president of the United States at some point. What's your take, Megan?
Okay, and I don't want to give too many of my inputs, but I think different generations, it's extremely important. It's in diversity. There's age, right? There's gender, there's ethnicity and race and so many other things, sexual orientation, but I think that generations should be treated the same, so it's great to have an environment where there's all different generations. Like, yes, if I was working with Coach Mike, we're very different, and we probably have very different views on a lot of things, but that's how you want to be able to find out how can we work together so that I can understand his pros and cons and in benefits and values from him and get the best value out of me and the best value out of him, and that's just a dynamic working environment. And so I think it's a plus to have all different age groups working together. So yeah.
I would just like to add one more thing. The culture of a company is set by its leadership. And as the leaders, the managers, it's very, very important to demonstrate the values that you have in your handbook. You know, it's not enough just to have the handbook and the training every other year. You have to actually show and walk the walk. For example, you know, if you as a manager are making comments that could be perceived by some people as either discriminatory or offensive in some way, then that's sending a message. And a lot of, one thing I've seen actually in some of the workforces that tend to be like startup companies with a lot more young people employed is that there's a more casual culture that people will, you know, including the managers, will, you know, want to be friends with their employees, and that's understandable, and sometimes people who have risen up through the ranks to be a manager still perceive themselves as friends with their workforce. But once you have that position of power, not only do you bind the company with that power and whatever you do with that power, but you're also your workforce has a perception of you. They see you in a different light, and that's important to keep in mind as an employer.
I think that's coined like the new bro culture, right?
Right.
Having the tables.
That's getting a lot of companies into trouble right now. So beware.
So we've kind of tapped in on it, and I think Dr. Andrews gave a lot of really great examples, but does anyone else have any day-to-day examples of policies and trainings that they've seen that have worked effectively? And not just policies and training, but actions that management has taken daily that has changed the culture. Does anyone have any last comments on that?
Well, I think in terms of corporations, what we've seen through Alpha is that many of the corporations that we work with have ERGs, employee resource groups. And so they are really focused on so many different levels. Like you said, it could be gender, it could be sexual orientation, it could be so many different things. And so I think the organizations are doing that to help their employees and increase that engagement. So it doesn't only stay within the company, it goes outside to the community. So with us, they really engage with us, and so that's another way of really engaging and making that point across.
Does anyone in the audience have any ERGs in their companies? Employee resource groups? Okay, I'm gonna do some research on them and get people out then. Okay, so controversial kind of question. In the news, there's a lot of public posts from male figures saying they're feeling confused and sometimes insulted or uncomfortable in their work environment because they feel like a compliment can be taken the wrong way, or they feel like a hug, or maybe even if they're trying to hire someone and they have a couple of males and an attractive female, that they'll feel like there's a stigma against them if they hire the female. So for all of the males out there and who are feeling this way, what are some tips, advice, and then we can talk about more specific details of what is the bottom line of okay and not okay, but starting with tips and advice to the public.
You want the troglodytes to start, or you want the women to start?
Well, I think it's the men's point of view, right?
Well, I want to start by saying, like, if you feel uncomfortable, that's a good thing. You're feeling something like that. You should be feeling that because it means something was going wrong. Then you're feeling uncomfortable because you're kind of like realizing that some shit was going wrong. So I think that's a good thing because I feel uncomfortable in situations and I've learned from that, and I think everybody should do that. So if you're feeling uncomfortable, get used to it.
Yeah, I think there's more awareness now, at least the thoughts are
No, she said enough for me to disagree. She said earlier.
There you go.
So a woman comes up to me and I'm at the city hall and I didn't do my collar right. Did I do it right today?
That's good.
Okay. And she adjusts my collar, right? She's got her lovely hands on my neck and she's playing with my collar. Should I report her for sexual harassment? That was a pretty intimate contact with me. She was right here. I could smell her, I could see her, I could feel her. She's messing around with me. Do I call HR? Was I being sexually harassed? Or was she being sweet because she doesn't want the mayor to go out there looking like a fool with his collar up in the back? So, I understand that's a periphery. So she's not propositioning me.
So maybe taking that instance or that example, does anyone have any comments on that example, maybe from the female perspective? Yeah.
Okay, so I could talk all day about these topics. First of all, a couple points regarding the male reaction. And I think on one sense it is good because it speaks to an awareness that men are having. That's great. However, I also think it's an overreaction. So by avoiding women altogether, which we've heard stories of, women. I've actually heard stories of men not wanting to meet with women behind closed doors, or not hiring a female to the team because
Mike Pence,
just want to avoid risk, right?
I won't meet with a woman. People, I have office hours and people come in to see me. I won't meet with a woman behind a closed door.
Why?
So I just don't want that she says something happened.
Well,
That's a good question.
okay, so and I think that's a valid fear
Open the
because
door.
Right.
I've heard this. Many men have this fear. I don't think it's a valid fear, and I think it's an overreaction because avoiding women is not addressing the issue. It's just avoiding the problem.
Well, I don't avoid it, but I won't have the door closed, the door
Right.
always open. If it's a guy, it doesn't occur to me to close it or open. I don't think of it. But if it's a woman, I definitely, a single woman, 2 women, it's okay. That's
Yeah.
funny.
Well, I
For the single woman, because then there's no witness.
Yeah, I mean, we do have a heightened awareness, which is the reason for that. But I also think we have to trust men and women. If we can't see an adult man and adult woman having behind a closed door having a meeting without the assumption it's a sexual relationship, then we need to get past that. We need to trust men and women first as being adults. But the other issue is the harassment piece and what's acceptable, what's not acceptable. Here's the formal definition. Sexual harassment is defined as an unwanted activity of a sexual nature that affects an individual's employment and creates a hostile work environment. So adjusting your collar is not creating a hostile work environment for you, but perhaps coming and making an off-color joke, even if you didn't intend, to offend, could actually offend. So keeping that in mind, it's affecting their employment and creating a hostile work environment is the definition of harassment. But the other point is, so I think we need to trust men and women. I think we need to be careful of not overreacting, because when we do that, it actually hurts women. It hurts women's individual careers because they don't have access to opportunities. But from a bigger perspective, it hurts the organization because they lose out on talent of women and women's contributions. So I don't think that's the answer at all. And I think we need to stop that. We need to stop thinking about, I'm just going to avoid women, I'm not going to be behind a closed door, I'm not going to hire a woman. We can't have that, because we will be maintaining the status quo and actually working against diversity and inclusion.
And that becomes the textbook definition of discrimination.
Yes.
Yes. Different treatment based on
Yes.
gender, or
Yes.
pick your protected class.
Let me just say
Perfect
one
segue.
thing. So, to your points, they're valid points, and you may disagree with me, but it's okay. So, when I was a kid growing up, my grandmother was from the old country in Italy, and she used to say to me, Mikey, I can hear your brains rattle. Now, I thought the woman couldn't speak English. I thought she was an idiot. What she was saying to me was, I can't hear what you're thinking in your head until it goes to your tongue, until it goes to my ear. I can't hear your brains rattle. I can't hear your brains rattling. And I learned a lesson in life about that a lot of people don't know what I'm thinking until I have the courage, perhaps, to verbalize it. So in companies I work with, I try to find out from the bosses, from the owners, from the managers, the senior management team, how do you communicate the culture of your company to your employees? Fair question, right? Say yes. Someone say yes. Someone at least sneeze or cough or something. Yes, it's a fair question, Coach Mike. Thank you for asking. You're welcome. Thank you for responding. So, a myriad of answers, but what happens many times, to your points, ladies, and they're valid points, is the men become, for lack of a better word, almost emasculated. And that's not what we're supposed to do. We're supposed to engage our employees. We're supposed to engage the people to say, so Josh, how would you change the way we're doing things now? Gee, Coach Mike, that's a loaded question. That's why I asked it, because I'm the head guy, what's in charge. Then I go to Rose. So Rose, what do you think we should change? And I start gathering input. Like a mayor, he gets input from a lot of people. Ultimately, it's his decision. Well, if I exclude women from that, I've been married to the same woman 37 and a half years. We have 3 beautiful children, 4 grandkids. I wouldn't even be here today without my wife, Mary Jane, okay? But my wife's been disabled for 25 years. So I've learned a lot about a lot of things in life. I guess that's why I'm on this panel today. Thank you. The point is, women bring such a good perspective to the conversation, and usually they think way deeper than men. Can I say that out loud to men here? It's true, guys, all right? These are very intelligent people. Women are smart, smarter than us most of the time. And without that perspective, I'm deficit in my ability to be a leader. I'm deficient in my ability to be a leader as a man. So I engage women. I may not agree with you. I may say, you know what, Rose, I appreciate that. Now, I don't say, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. That's not the way how to win friends and influence people, right, Dale Carnegie? You say, thank you for that, I appreciate that. Let me ponder that, and let me get back to you. And I think that's a fair communication style to you people out here. If you don't know how to talk to somebody, say, you know what, Josh, I need to ask you a question. I'm a little confused here, I'm a little confused. Can you help me? Anytime you ask for help, people are more than willing to help. But don't have a hidden agenda behind it. Well, I do not like that. And as a coach, I catch a lot of owners sometimes with this I gotcha mentality. You don't want that in your organization. So I hope that helps me.
Question.
Yes, sir.
How do you change leadership and culture when you have the wrong leadership and culture at the top? And it's, there's no problem here. We don't have any issues. Maybe you might be the problem. Maybe you should leave. How do you deal and engage with that?
I think Samantha asked.
They're all
I-
topsy-turvy. Crushing things.
Well, sometimes it has to be a lawsuit. I mean, so if you have a company, for example, where you're talking about somebody at a very high level who's like a CEO, who is engaging in discrimination or is setting the culture, I mean, obviously, culture is a broad term. There are certain things in workplace cultures, that may not be illegal, but they may not engender a motivated workforce. But if we're talking about discrimination, harassment, retaliation types of stuff, then you might have to go to the board of directors. If there's a board of directors that's above the person who's engaging in the alleged behavior. A lot of times, you'll have somebody who's accusing you can't deal with it with your internal HR department because that person is above, in rank. And so you have to go, above. And sometimes if it's at the very, very top, then that workplace culture, unfortunately, won't be changed unless there's a lawsuit.
Well, Fox News. So the CEO, I'm blanking on his name right now.
Roger Ailes.
Roger Ailes.
Roger Ailes. Sexual harassment claim, repeated sexual harassment claims, eventually resigned, and then what happens? Bill O'Reilly, who also worked for Fox News. So it sets the tone. If you have it in leadership, it sets the tone for the culture of the company, and it basically subconsciously tells people that this type of behavior is okay. So it's toxic. Basically, it's toxic when you have leaders that set that tone. Matt Lauer was the face at CBS, NBC. Harvey Weinstein, what was the face, the key, the linchpin in entertainment world. So it does set the tone. And so when we have those toxic leaders, getting rid of them is the best thing we can do. Or lawsuits. But if not, I would say leaving the company is probably the next best option. And filing those formal complaints. And if you don't get anywhere with those complaints, then if it's embedded in the culture, it's very difficult to change the culture until the leadership changes.
So better call Samantha, right? Better call Samantha.
Yeah. I don't litigate anymore.
So if, going along, digressing a little bit, if you can't change leadership and you decide to move on, is there any place in the Me Too movement and the whole thing of sexual discrimination for men? How can men become an active part of this to be part of the solution? Is there a place or not?
Oh, well, men are part of this. It's actually, we have to have men and women working together to dialogue, to talk about it openly, not just sweep it under the carpet, which in a lot of organizations, even today, it's the elephant in the room, So I think we need to address it. We need to talk openly about it. And someone on the panel alluded to this. If you're not comfortable with something or you're not sure how to approach it, ask. And just say, I know in the past we haven't really worked together, but I'd really like to come together and talk about how we can support each other. Say something. If you're uncomfortable, say something about, perceived behaviors.
One thing about these diversity issues that we come across, and talked it over with clients, and I would actually like everyone to answer this question, that a lot of diversity issues we all agree with, but the decision makers are the older 55-year-old white guy who's in the C-suite, and he's calling the shots. So how do you communicate to the old white 55-year-old guy who has more money that he can spend, his grandkids have more money that they can spend? How do you move the needle on this guy who really doesn't have to do anything? How do you communicate to him, and how do you communicate to him the importance of this issue?
Well, as the old rich white guy, I suppose I should answer that first. So in my city, I've introduced special needs resource fair, special needs committee. We have more programming for special needs people than any other city in Orange County. We have special needs dancers. We're very aggressive in our affordable housing, looking for people with lower incomes, providing affordable housing for them. We got 51 new beds for seniors on limited incomes. We're building another $4 million place for affordable housing. We have, I worked successfully and got a female mayor pro tem.
So Mayor Gardner, how could
Previously,
someone?
but it's,
Yeah, how do you approach Fred Whitaker, for
rich
example?
white men are
Yeah.
necessarily anti-diversity.
But how would you approach a guy like Fred Whitaker, right-wing CEO type,
Or maybe
to
even
explain to
how-
him that these issues are important and that's something he should look out for?
Or maybe even how could someone approach you if you're the rich older white guy in the room? Then how if someone wanted to bring a new point across to you?
You
what would
know,
be the best
the
way?
thing about us old rich white guys is we're pretty set in our ways, and we've had a pretty good life and reasonably successful. I'm not sure there's all that much change available to me. So if you find that rich old white guy you don't like, you probably want to oust him, either through a lawsuit or by outing him in the press, or if he's an elected person, by voting somebody else in there. I think it's a terrible thing for someone trained as a clinical psychologist to say. That being said, your chances of changing that person are probably minimal. So you want to get rid of that person, or work around that person, etc. Find the replacement for that person,
Right.
etc. But I don't think the age, it's not my age, it's not my race, it's not my economic status, it's not my background that makes me anti-women, anti-black, anti-etc., etc. That, you know, it's not confined. You'll find good people who are rich old white people and
Yeah.
bad people. Find the good people, support them, oppose the bad people, and try to get rid of them.
Good
So
answer,
if I
good answer.
were- just to dig a little bit deeper, because so you're saying there's no way, but if I worked for you and I want to come to you and say, you know, in the city of Lake Forest, there's this huge issue with discrimination, gender discrimination, and here's what I see exactly, and here's what I propose. You're saying there was no way you'd listen to me, or is there a best way
No,
for me
that's
to
a
approach
special
you?
needs people came to me. I said, let's set up a special needs committee. The people concerned with animals came to me. I said, let's set up a animal committee. The people concerned with traffic, I said, let's set up a traffic portion. I'm the wrong person to talk to about that, because I've already been in the forefront of most of these movements. The question you ask, and what I'm suggesting, is where you find somebody who isn't open, but you don't waste your time.
Yeah.
You come up with a lot of other strategies to try to get rid of that people, because the people in Harvey Weinstein, you could have talked to him forever. He wasn't going to change what he was doing. Or Bill O'Reilly. You're going to sit Bill O'Reilly down to Bill? I think you've not been doing the best. Guys making millions of dollars, these people are successful. You're not going to change them. I believe you're wasting your time.
Is it understanding the dynamic? Are we talking power, but power political, power versus economic? If you talk to the shareholders or you talk to the advertisers of a particular television station and you say, hey, let's boycott, you might get action. Or if you're talking about a political person that isn't going that way, then it's votes that it takes to move that person out. So we're really talking about power. Would you agree? And the dynamic of how to affect the power shift to represent the people that it serves?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes, it absolutely is about power. So we have, globally, if you look at organizations globally, there are many more men in positions of power than women. And so that contributes to the leadership gender gap that we have, and actually, and harassment cultures as well, because it breeds you know, that type of culture. But it's about power, but I think there's another angle, another perspective. It's also about fairness. And I find with men in particular, if you appeal to men, there are even older men who's set their ways. There's still a percentage that are willing to learn and change. But I found that if you, because I'm very data driven, you know, very research driven, but so you can present the data about diversity, inclusion, you know, benefits, and having women, you know, more women as part of the, you know, leadership and you know, anti-harassment, but the data doesn't always work. So I find with men, if you appeal to their sense of fairness, it actually goes farther. If you get men to really believe that discrimination in the workplace, harassment in the workplace significantly impacts not only an individual, but their contributions. It affects engagement, it affects talent management. And so if you really break it down, it appeals to their sense of fairness. That's why I find men get it, and men will get on board more.
I would agree with that. I would agree that when I work with let's say a group of people that are leaders, and they're men, and they're older, I like to do an assessment first, and I assess where they fit in all the assessment grids, okay? And a lot of times men that run or lead companies tend to be task-oriented and rather fast-paced. This is general. You can probably disagree with me later.
I'm agreeing.
Okay, so far. But the point is, when you find someone who has a tendency, male or female, to be more task-focused and more of a fast-paced, let's get it done person, the blind spot of that behavior is people, listening, data, new ideas. So part of my work with some of the older white guys is to say, I'll pick on Josh. So Josh, here's my observation of how
Older
you
Hispanic.
operate. And I give him my assessment of how he operates. And usually I'm pretty blunt, pretty direct, because I'm gray hair, belly, grandkids. I don't want to prove my resume again to you. So I say, I see a blind spot here that I think could be affecting your leadership. And most of the time, to your point, they agree. They say, my wife's been telling me this for 25 years. And have you listened? I go back to listening. I know I sound like a broken record, so please forgive me. The answer is no. You know why you don't listen, or you can't listen or won't listen? Because she's right and you're wrong. That's the problem. It's a power trip, pal. And I'll tell you right now, if I were you, and I'm not, but if I were you, I'd come off that horse. I'd come off that high horse and start listening more before you pass on. And by me being that point of the spear, blunt in your face, because I have a relationship, I've earned my keep, so to speak, they listen. I say, now, do you want me to hold you accountable to this change in your behavior modification? Mm-hmm. Because perception is reality. Mm-hmm. Hello? And a lot of times I see that they're willing to make incremental changes if it's done more in an atmosphere of, my word, not yours, love, as opposed to I'm going to beat your brains in and knock you dead. So in the HR world and in the employment world, I love that approach. Go appeal to someone's sense of fairness. I don't care if you're old or young or tall or fat or rich or skinny, black, white, green, it doesn't matter. If you appeal to someone's sense of fairness and what's right, I think the data would suggest most people will change in that atmosphere.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay?
No. Oh, go ahead. All right, thanks. Here we are competing. All right.
But you guys are nice about it. Guys were
You're
fighting.
nice.
Polite, very
Very
polite.
nice, very nice.
Very
We know
polite.
how to interact and collaborate, yes. So I wanted to make a point that the question was about the person and the individual. I propose to you that we look not only that, but some other issues that are going on. And by doing that, everybody that's a decision maker really is involved and is aware and knows the things that need to happen from that point on. It could lead to talent resource gaps. It could lead to other things that the company wants to do. But what does a company want to do, really? What's their strategic destination? And so if harassment or anything else is stopping them, then that really is going to lead them into changes that they need to make.
So speaking to Josh's hypothetical, first of all, let me say that 55 is not that old.
Here, here.
As a 50-year-old, I hear you, yeah.
Second of all, I think, one of the things we've seen that's been highlighted by the Me Too movement is the power of social media to, sort of out these people and to show, I think that, social media has allowed this kind of information about such people to spread rapidly and results in affecting the bottom line of a company. So I think a lot of times when you have somebody who's at the high leadership level of a company, they've gotten there not because they've been fair. Right? Not always. Sometimes maybe. But they've gotten there, they've been competitive, they've had to fight to get to their position usually. And so I think a lot of times people like that will respond to bottom line type of arguments, such as this is going to affect the profitability of the company, this adverse publicity is going to, send our shareholders packing, things like that, I think are also, and again, it depends on the individual really and what kind of personality you're dealing with, but I think that has been very effective, and we've seen that in the past decade. Boycotts, things like that, protests.
So a lot of the discussion so far has been on men to female discrimination, and there's been a little bit of female to male, but how prevalent is female to male sexual discrimination, and what are your experiences with that?
You mean female superiors and
Yeah,
subordinates?
female
Male
superiors. Yeah, female superiors to male subordinates, or just female to male in the workplace, making them feel uncomfortable. And is that a thing? Is it?
I wouldn't say it's a thing. It can happen. It does happen. Not nearly as much as the other way around. But there is an interesting statistic. I mentioned I teach at Pepperdine. I teach an MBA program, and so one of the statistics is in my head because I teach it. But it talking about sexual harassment in the workplace, the incidence of men actually reporting harassment has been on the rise. And it's risen from about 10% of all sexual harassment claims to about 17% in the last few years. So men actually are even coming forward now more than they used to. So it does happen to men. I mean, it's still less than a fifth, 20%. Still 85% women, 20%, 50%
So is that coming
men.
from female superiors or just general female?
Not necessarily
workforce?
female superiors, but just harassment in general, and that could be it could take any form. Could be physical, could be verbal, could be just creating a hostile work environment, could be exclusion, from, you have in-groups and out-groups in a workplace, and so it could be, being a part of the out-group consistently, things like that.
So a question to, I guess, the women in the audience, or the women on the panel who were qualified to answer this question, as far as harassment. And this is something that's happened to me a couple times. I've always wondered about it. It was no big deal to me. But I would like your perspective from an HR perspective and from a legal perspective. Let's say a woman hits on me, right? And I say, no, we work together. I don't want to go. I don't want to cross that line. And then she goes back and tells everybody else at work that I'm gay because I want to accept her advance. How does that is handled from a corporate perspective?
So we'll go back to the definition. So the definition is an unwanted sexual advance that affects your employment and creates a hostile work environment for you. So the first part of it, if someone hits on you and you're not interested, okay, is that a hostile work environment? Not really. But if rumors start spreading and then, broader and broader, and it comes back and it does affect you, that could be a case for a hostile work environment. So it depends.
So her going back and telling all of my coworkers that I am gay creates a hostile work environment.
It could create a hostile work environment for you, or it could not.
Or if some guy who is anti-gay starts a fight with me, then that would constitute a hostile work environment.
So going to the definition of hostile work environment, we kind of have to leave it up to us to decide, right, whether being hit on is or isn't, or starting rumors is or isn't. How can we define it more strictly, or do you have any ideas how we could change in the future?
So just to add to the legal definition of sexual harassment, so there's hostile work environment sexual harassment, and there's quid pro quo sexual harassment. So the quid pro quo everybody knows about, I'll rub my back, I'll rub your back if you rub mine kind of thing, literally. So hostile environment is, so the key focus is on the recipient of the behavior, the person who, to whom the behavior is directed. It's their perspective, whether it's unwelcome from their perspective, and whether it's so severe or pervasive as to change their work environment. So severity and pervasiveness are two independent ways in which we get to a hostile work environment. Either it's so severe, such as, for example, a forcible kiss or a touch, an unwanted touch, or worse. The pervasiveness comes to, whether, so the rumor spreading, for example. But if, for example, you have a coworker who asks you out, and you say, oh, no, and it doesn't bug you that they ask you out and nothing else happens, then, that's because it's your perspective that it wasn't unwelcome and it wasn't so severe or pervasive that it altered your work environment, then that's not going to be found to be sexual harassment. And so, you really have to look at how it affects the individual. And there may be some people who are affected more deeply because of that. And of course we have, so sex discrimination and sex harassment does include same-sex sexual harassment, harassment based on sexual orientation or gender identity. That's been an issue that has been coming up, and we've seen in the media a lot lately. The issues surrounding transgender rights in the workplace. So it can have all kinds of different permutations.
So I think kind of combining two of your points is just defining a hostile work environment, but then also, like you said in the very beginning, sometimes a reaction to a hostile touch or something like that, right? So if someone comes to me and touches me in a weird way, but my reaction is like a nervous laugh, like, because I don't really know how to think of that. And so then the person maybe says, oh, she liked that, it's okay to do it again. So what's just your advice for someone who naturally has like the awkward laughter reaction, or some type of reaction, to stop it from the first action, I guess. That makes sense. I mean, it can be obvious, but just, yeah.
So for it to be harassment, the person doesn't actually have to say stop it. It just has to be unwelcome to them. They don't necessarily have to voice it for it to be harassment. So let me just set that as a. Yeah. But for somebody, say for a younger worker who's newly in the workforce, I think going to the points that have been made so far today, communication is really key. I think, there are a lot of ways to approach it depending on who is, doing whatever. Like, so if somebody is giving you an uncomfortable hug, you can say, sorry, I'm not a hugger, or you can, there are a number of ways in which to address it. But I think just firm communication, without emotion, and not just being matter of fact, I have found, often works in many different kinds of situations.
Yeah, that's just what I've always seen. I've heard confusion in conversation of like, well, they never said anything, but why they continue to do that? So I know there's always questions as to how do you define and things like that. So
it's murky waters.
Yeah, murky waters definitely.
I would say if you're uncomfortable about anything, whether it's a topic, whether it's touching anything like that, just be direct. Be direct, be honest, and say, I'm really uncomfortable talking about this, or I'm uncomfortable about this, whatever is going on. And so accept, okay, great, let's move on. And it doesn't have to be something that you dwell on. And things just happen naturally. And hopefully it doesn't happen again.
Yeah. And most of the time people are genuinely sorry. They didn't realize it. It wasn't their intent. And, intent doesn't matter in the sexual harassment analysis. It's the perception of the person who is receiving the behavior. But, oftentimes you'll find that people say, oh, sorry, I didn't mean it that way, and they're happy that you've been direct with them.
And kind of wrapping it up and moving things forward, like Neil said in the beginning, there have been a couple big instances in history, I think it was 81, 91, and today, where sexual harassment has been brought up publicly, and it's been brought up as a huge issue and concern, and there have been attempts to reduce sexual harassment in the workforce, but never super successful. So what are some closing thoughts on how we can really make a difference, how we can change the work environment, and any other closing comments?
Okay, so, did anyone else raise their hand?
No.
Okay. I don't want to hog the floor.
Want everybody to answer, so we'll go from right to left.
Okay, sounds good. There's two main reasons. One is socialization, how we're socialized as men and women, and I'll speak to that in a minute. And the other is the culture of our society as a whole. So the socialization piece, so what socialization is, it's a way that we learn to behave in society in a way that's acceptable to society. So it's a way we behave as men and women. Socialization starts the minute we come out of the womb, and we carry that into the workplace as adults. And so men are taught to be tough, independent, take risks, don't show your feelings, and men are also taught to have power over women through messages. They're taught that. It may be indirect, but that's the message that men often get, and boys often get, is to have power over girls, have power over women. So these messages are strongly and consistently reinforced through our TV, our movies, books, society, even our parents, our teachers, school. So men are taught, have power over women, right? So that creates environments, it creates masculine cultures, but it also creates environments where men seek to have power over women. And so the environment is ripe for harassment from that aspect. So socialization is a big piece, and it strongly affects how we show up as men and women. The other part of it is the culture. If you've ever done any work on culture or looked into culture, there's a psychologist called Hofstede who's looked at culture, global cultures, and he measures global cultures on 6 dimensions. One dimension is masculinity versus femininity. The U.S. is actually ranked globally out of 53 countries. The U.S. ranks 15. So we are actually a very masculine culture. So what that means is that as a whole, society values masculine roles more than female roles. And so because we have a masculine culture and because of socialization, boys are taught to have power over women, we have this culture of harassment that is continued. So I'm not aware of those 3 points. I'm not aware of that data that you just, but harassment's always been there. We've always had a masculine culture. Socialization we will always have, but and I'm bringing this up because it's important that we have awareness about it and we start talking about it. And so I think those are the main reasons that we still see harassment today.
And any calls to action or anything that you would recommend as your number one advice to make a change?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, I think we need to. So I think we're doing boys and men a disservice in how we socialize them. Honestly, it's ridiculous to say you have to be tough, don't cry, and don't show your feelings. It's absolutely ludicrous. It's also ludicrous that we tell women that they can't be assertive and confident as well. And so the socialization is not necessarily a good thing, right? Because we're trying to fit into these boxes. So my biggest advice is be yourself, be authentic, treat all people with respect. And as I mentioned earlier, we need to teach men that true leadership and power is about equality and fairness. And we also need to value women's contributions more.
I think we've seen a shift since 1991. I was in law school then when the Anita Hill hearings were going on, and at that time, if I recall correctly, there was a lot of sort of victim blaming type of dialogue in the media over this. I think now, even though we see internet trolls that are doing the victim blaming, I think the broader culture is now recognizing that this truly is a pervasive problem. I think we're handling it differently now. I think the dialogue has really begun in earnest this time around. And with regard to the socialization of boys and men, I think there's also been a shift in the generation that has come behind us. My generation has raised the millennials. And I think that because in my generation there were a lot more women in the workforce, I think that sort of translated to socializing our children differently. So I do have hope, for the future, and I do think that the dialogue now has changed for the better and for progress.
Quick question. What can we do? The 3 different times we've had sexual harassment situations things that can be done to change it. Action. That's so that we don't in another 30 years have the same conversation.
Well, it has to start with how we raise our children.
Yeah.
And I think that's what we're seeing now is that finally the generations that are coming behind us have been, the embodiment of the action.
Well, I think it really boils down to two things. One, or more than two things, but absolutely the way we raise our girls and our boys, but also changing our cultures and valuing diversity of all types. So we're talking about gender primarily here, but other types of diversity rolls up under gender. So race, ethnicity, religion, background, LGBT, disability, it all rolls up under gender. And so that's why my main research is on gender, because from a diversity perspective, it's big, right? It's the umbrella. And so I think changing our socialization, changing our cultures, and changing how we value women's contributions in society will help change the cultures of organizations.
Yeah, and
So-
a lot of the earlier discussion was on the values of the leadership, and that's really what it comes down to. So I guess the only way we were saying to change it is to change the values when they're younger and instill it so that the values later down the road are aligned with diverse thinking, right?
Now looking,
You can change it now too. People do
Yes,
change.
of course, of course.
Right.
Preventative,
Exactly.
yeah.
I mean, we're having this discussion right now.
Yeah.
Right.
Which is a good thing. So, I mean, having said everything I just said about socialization and
Yeah.
culture, I am encouraged. I think we're moving in the right direction. It's baby steps, it's slow progress, but I do see signs that are positive. So I think having discussions like this is great. These should happen every day in the workplace. Yeah, and at home.
so in addition to that, I think it might be worthwhile to take a look at our own values. So values within the organization, but what do we value? What's important to us? And perhaps from there, go ahead and take a few steps. Social media is available, all right? Get together with your groups, post, be proactive in terms of development, personal development, about your leadership, about being strong, and what actions are acceptable and what is not. So I would encourage more networking in that positive direction so that we can be more preventative as opposed to reactive.
I agree about the socialization. My wife and I homeschooled our children, and there's an old corny saying, people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. And we used to quote unquote preach that because it was important for me as a dad and my wife Mary Jane raising Luciano, Giovanna, and Michael Vincent to say, people want to know that you care about them. You're going to be smart, you're going to be great citizens, you're going to be great people. So I think that's a real key. And growing up from a dysfunctional family, I didn't have a lot of basis of that. And it wasn't until I actually met people of faith and I said, how do you do this parenting thing? As well, consider the 10 Commandments first of all. But that was a biggie. I mean, in my house, the Bible was a big white thing that sat on the coffee table. Do you still have coffee tables today in America? Coffee tables for the doilies and all that. I never read it. I just looked at it. I looked at the pictures, right? And I started reading it and found out there's ways that you can do that. So I agree with that socialization. The other thing I think is changing, and I am glad to hear your hope because I share your hope. I think we're starting to listen. I know I sound like a guy at a crazy record broken. I think men are starting to actually listen and saying, that's a good point you're making. I hadn't thought of that. Or thank you for that perspective. It challenges me. Okay? There's nothing wrong with being challenged if in fact the point of the challenge is to cause us to grow, evolve, whatever that is. And part of my purpose in life is to help you understand we can agree to disagree agreeably. You don't have to question my birthright. My mom and dad were married when I was born. That's not necessary. They call me names and vice versa. Don't go into the shaming thing. But if we can learn to agree to disagree agreeably, then we can say, well, why don't we just park this issue here? We agree to disagree here, okay? And move on. And I find that helpful for me because there are a lot of times where I actually agree with people and they don't think I do. Their perception is I don't agree with them. And I say, haven't you misjudged me? Don't you think, can I have my time in court, Your Honor? And next thing you know, I share, so Mike, you agree with me. Yes. Isn't that a surprise? John, yes, it is. So communication, and I like your word, firm communication. If you have convictions, live by your convictions. Now, if your convictions are completely off base and you are from Mars, what's that book, Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus? Spaghetti brain. But the whole idea of communication is to listen, to learn, not to listen to argue. And that, I think that's going to help.
And
move
listen to
the ball.
understand as well.
Listen to understand. So that's my 2 cents worth. Thank you.
Okay, tough to sum up. I agree with a lot of the things that have been said about it. I don't believe that men are taught to have power over women. I think the Bible and Eve, like the first part of the Bible tells us it's the opposite way. It's not that way at all. And I don't think there's anything wrong with a masculine culture. I mean, is somebody here not living in the best world that's ever existed, in the best country that ever existed, and despite the fact that maybe my life could be a little bit better here or a little bit better there, I mean, who's kidding who? This is the greatest country on earth. We're probably living in the greatest time during the greatest country on earth. And if that took us being a masculine culture, then I hope to goodness we stay a masculine culture. Whatever it is that brought us this far should keep us this far. Does that mean we can't be better? Of course we can be better. And this movement is about being better, but there's really, you know, Winston Churchill used to say, democracy is the second best thing of following everything else. And I think our culture is the same thing, which isn't to say that it can't be better. How does it get better? Just by a lot of the things that people have talked about here, by fairness, by modeling appropriate behavior, by being against discrimination, by valuing diversity, by understanding it's a long-run fight on segregation, 150 years. So you're saying, well, what have we done in the last 20 years? Well, maybe it's going to be 100 years. Maybe it's going to take longer than 20 years. You've got to be in the battle for the long term, not the short term. To do that, I think it's vital to oppose the evil in the world. That sounds a little biblical, but there are people who do bad things, who promote bad things, and it's not enough to leave the job. We have to actively oppose those kinds of people and the things that they do, and do whatever it is we can to defeat them. I know that's a terribly masculine thing to say, but I think without opposing evil, you let evil flourish, and this is clearly something we don't want in our world. So we have to not simply fight it, but actively oppose it, and all of it is incremental. It may have been, 1991, and it's better now, with the understanding that what we're doing here will make it better in 5 or 10 more years, and that it's so we're fighting to make it better.
Awesome. Thank you, Mayor Gardner. Now, Cash, I know that you've been saving up a lot to say. Gonna wrap us up with that.
Well, I don't want to pretend to be any more of an expert than anybody else that's spoken before me, but I do want to disagree with Mayor Gardner just a little bit, because I think that statements like this country is the greatest country in the history of the world apply to a certain population within our country, but it may not apply to everybody. And when we're talking about diversity, we're talking about everybody. We're talking about the diverse country, the diverse society we live in. And for me, that is emblematic of that this is a systematic issue. An issue that is within the entire organization, within our entire society. It's something that it's part of why I'm motivated to be involved in politics, is that this is a systematic issue. So our policies have to change. Not just the people themselves, but the policies that govern how those people interact and what they do. And I think that our approach should reflect that as well. So that's why I work for people that believe that.
Great quotes.
I told you he's going to be president.
Any last
I was
questions
joking.
or comments from the group here? Yes, right here.
Question.
Sure.
So, being that we have a diverse panel here, I think mainly, as a question, maybe sum it up. I guess, would you say that most of the Me Too movement actually does come from an upper doing it to someone who's lower in the company? and therefore we can all agree that leadership in our society is definitely skewed to a certain demographic, mostly. How do we, I think we have some like HR people in here as well, but how do we teach society that really maybe the best solution is to start reprogramming and retraining our leadership, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it starts really not with the employees reading a handbook, not with understanding someone's background or understanding that, oh, maybe if they hug me, like they don't mean it, or if they supposedly had someone touch them in a way and they didn't report it. Like, how do we reprogram their minds to understand that it's not about necessarily being oversensitized or emasculated in this Me Too movement, and it's really about reprogramming the leadership roles and people in power to understand, I guess, what sort of progress we're trying to make, right? And at the end of the day, make our work environment a lot more diverse. Because I'm in the workforce now, right? So I don't want it to be us raising our kids in hopes for a better work community, right? Like, how do we change what we have now and the leadership we have now?
I think by having ongoing conversations and dialogue. So I mentioned earlier that I alluded to appeal to men's sense of fairness. So leadership in general is, so as I mentioned, men hold the vast majority of positions of power in our global societies, right? So, but I think it's appealing. So data works, but appealing to their sense of fairness, but having the discussion, having the dialogue, and saying, these policies affect me. This culture affects me. I don't feel I can be myself at work. I don't feel I fully can contribute at work. It's easier said than done. Of course, it's going to take time to affect our culture. From a gender perspective, if you look at the leadership gender gap, the data shows that we will not reach a gender parity for about 200 years or longer. So that means nobody in this room will be alive when we reach gender parity in leadership, if we ever do reach gender parity. So we have a ways to go when it comes to having diversity and inclusion being embraced more, having more gender parity in leadership roles. I think it is slowly getting better. I think more leaders and more organizations are getting on the diversity and inclusion bandwagon, and they're starting to get it. They're starting to realize the value of diversity and inclusion. And as a global society, we're becoming more diverse every day. And diversity is not going away. That's a really key point. It is not going away. So if you're an older white male, you happen to be in a leadership position, and not to pick on older white males, but that's the demographic. That's the demographic in leadership. It's not going away. And we are starting to see shifts in a positive direction where more companies want to be diverse and inclusive. Unfortunately, a lot of them don't know how, and they haven't put enough measures in place to truly be inclusive, but they want to be. And so I think the will to get there keeps growing, and that's a very positive thing. So I think keep having the discussions, keep having the dialogue, communicate what's important to you, and eventually we'll start moving the needle.
There are several industries that really have been more notorious in terms of having sexual harassment being more pervasive. So yes, and I can really see the change from many years ago, from 10, 20 years ago. So I think what's important is, in order to be able to change, is connect with your diversity and inclusion officer, with your HR department if you don't have a D&I individual. Form a group, form a committee among employees, and then maybe put together a proposal to your HR department. I think by doing something like that, then that will elevate the issue, make it more as a group as opposed to an individual action item. Or maybe bring in some other individuals from the outside, neutral parties that might be able to help position you.
It sounds like you're a leader. I get leadership jumping off the page with you in your question.
No, my voice was shaking.
No, I know, you're a leader.
You had the courage to talk,
But
though.
there's no
Came
question,
out.
leader, and it took a lot of courage, so thank you for having the courage to pop up and say, hey, what about all this malarkey, blah, 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 blah. Let's cut to the bottom line. I perceive you're a leader.
Sounds like a CEO to me. Yeah.
I perceive that you're frustrated in your company because you have things you want to say, and either you don't have an outlet to say them, or you've said them, they're not being heard.
It's actually in response to like the responses we've gotten to a lot of the ways to address these situations. A lot of the times the response was putting it back on the employee or the person who's uncomfortable, and really like I think we've seen from data and the numbers that come in, it's actually the leadership. And so for people who are part of the HR department and stuff, maybe it's not about an employee handbook or anything like that. It's more of reprogramming your leadership to really understand what a professional, diverse work environment is.
Oh.
Can I just say one thing in relationship to that? Leadership changes. Everybody that's not a leader now has the potential to be the leader in the future. So it's learning. It's passing it on. You don't have to take everything that comes from the previous generation. You make it better. That's one of the things that we learn.
And Megan can hire you as a HR, right? HR chief. So there you go. That's what we're here for.
And if you're not happy, quit. All of those things I agree with, and if they all fail, get your butt up and quit, and let it be known why you quit. Talent is really vital to companies. If you're a good employee, companies will hate to lose you, so that your ultimate vote is with your feet.
Yeah, this is honestly isn't addressing my personal experience.
No.
You're not gonna like that.
Personal, but anybody.
She's like, I
But it's reprogramming people's minds that it's actually, you gotta start at the top, right? Like it's definitely directly related to power. Power, it's this sort of, we are humans, we get this other personality traits that come with power, and that's abuse of it. Or even thinking that you're above the rules that are maybe in your handbook. And that's why we get all these news reports and these extreme cases. It's always the person at the top.
And I hate to be pessimistic, really. Did Harvey Weinstein change? Did Bill Cosby change? Did Bill O'Reilly change? Your ability to influence those people at the top, I think, is minimal.
They'll change in jail.
Well spoken. Well spoken.
I think we're going to wrap it up because we have a couple of other things to cover, some really cool awards. But thank you, everyone.
Awesome
for
panel.
Let's give the
this
panel a big
amazing
applause.
panel. And thank you for joining and in a great audience and some questions in the end. I loved it, so thank you
And
again.
thank you, Megan, for
Oh,
being
yes.
a great
Awesome
moderator.
monitor.
A couple of housekeeping things real quick before we get going. We got a lot of people out in the line. They're out there saying, hey, we're ready to get employed. Hey, it's officially Diversity Employment Day in Orange County and also in the city of
Lake Forest.
Lake Forest, okay?
Yes.
So if you'd like to have a copy of this to document your company's participation here today, don't hesitate to contact Nikki, part of our team there. She'll make sure that you get a copy of this. But our panel was great. Thank you so very much for the information. Hey, like you said, Dr. Sean, this can go on all day. This could be a conference, workshops, and everything else.
Right.
But we had a little glimpse in here. I think everybody got something out of it, and it just makes our world a better place to live in and a better place to work in. But what I'd like to do is one of our favorite things we like at City Career Fair is we always like to recognize those companies and individuals that not only talk the talk, but walk the walk. And we recognize them with our Diversity Spirit Achievement Award. It's a way of underscoring their actions. So if you want to emulate them, be aware that diversity is really a good thing. It's just not a trendy thing. Then these are the people, these are the companies and individuals that you should keynote in on. And today, we'd like to recognize, with our Diversity Spirit Achievement Award, Mayor Jim Gardner. So let's give him a big applause. Thank you so much. I appreciate all the work you've done to support diversity. Here you go.
Thank you very much.
Say a few words.
As I said before, there are people out there in our city. We have rooms for people lower socioeconomic status. We have the first woman manager in Lake Forest history. We just hired her last week, and the mayor pro tem. So we don't have a diversity department. We don't push everything in fairness. And by pushing fairness, all these things will emerge. So it's important. I said oppose evil, and I guess the other side of that is to find people who are doing what it is you value. There's a politician who's pushing the kinds of things that you value, or an employer who's doing some really good things, or a lawyer or a university that's teaching something. Go support those people. It's as important to support the people who are doing good as it is to oppose the people who are doing bad. So I really appreciate this very much. Thank you so much.
And at City Career Fair and the Diversity Recruiters Network, we always thought everybody that's on the panel deserves recognition. And so we also have for each one of you our little token, a little commemoration of your participation being a panelist here on Diversity Employment Day in Orange County. So it's not as large as the mayor's, but it gives you something to strive for. And hey, who knows, maybe in the future the audience will get recognized for their efforts as well. But today, thank you so very much. We appreciate your input and everything that you've done. Now, we've got a great career fair out there. We've got hundreds of candidates out there that are ready to come on in. Can I ask the panel, can you stick around for a few minutes, because maybe some of our guests here might have a couple of questions, okay? But again, thank you so much for supporting diversity in the workplace, and we'll see you at the career fair. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Hey, thanks again. See you in Hong Kong.
Yeah.
Thank you. We need to partner. Sure. Well, I'll reach out to you.
Let's do that.
Well, did Sherry tell you the truth?
No.
So what